Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry for the slight delay. Welcome. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History. I'm sure you've seen some of our upcoming programming on the slides that we're just running. So please, I hope you join us again. And just one general announcement before I introduce Judy. At the Center for Jewish History, we are running our summer reading schmooze, where the public, our followers, all of you send us your book recommendations, and we share some of them on social media. And once a month at our author talks, we announce that month's winner of some CJH swag. Today's winner is Mimi Clemens from Germantown, Tennessee. She is recommending a book called America's Jewish Women: A History from Colonial Times to Today by Pamela Nadell. And she was one of 3 readers to recommend that book to us this summer. So please check it out, America's Jewish Women. It's a 2019 title, and it's very appropriate in light of this afternoon's conversation. And her recommendation reads, just in part, I'll read one sentence, a very readable and interesting look at how Jewish women entered into the American population and rose to be leaders, either in front of the screens or behind, in civil rights, voting equality, social services, and women's equality. So please keep those recommendations coming. And for today, you can ask your questions in the Q&A function in the Zoom. Please remember to use the Q&A, not the chats, so we can see all your questions in one place, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And thank you in advance to our 2 ASL interpreters, Stephanie and Jessica, who will be switching off. And now I will introduce Judy, and I'm going to abridge her list of her list of accomplishments, because if I listed everything, we wouldn't have time for a conversation. She really is that impressive, and you'll have to read the book for the rest of the details. Judy Heumann is a lifelong advocate for the rights of disabled people. She contracted polio in 1949 in Brooklyn, New York, and began to use a wheelchair for mobility. She is now an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights community. Her memoir, authored with Kristen Joyner, is Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist, published by Beacon Press. She is featured in Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, a 2020 American award-winning documentary film available on Netflix. She has also been featured in numerous documentaries on the history of the disability rights movement and delivered a TED Talk in 2016, Our Fight for Disability Rights and Why We're Not Done Yet. As a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation from 2017 to 19, she wrote Roadmap for Inclusion, Changing the Face of Disability in Media. She also currently serves on a number of nonprofit boards. Judy was a founding member of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, which was the first grassroots center in the United States and helped to launch the independent living movement both nationally and globally. In 1983, she co-founded the World Institute on Disability, one of the first global disability rights organizations founded and continually led by people with disabilities. From 1993 to 2001, Judy served in the Clinton administration as the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in the Department of Education. She then served as the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development from 2002 to 2006. President Obama appointed Judy as the first special advisor for international disability rights at the US Department of State, where she served from 2010 to 2017. Throughout her life, Judy has traveled on her motorized wheelchair to countries on every continent, in urban and rural communities alike. She has played a role in the development and implementation of major legislation, including the IDEA, Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Judy graduated from Long Island University in 1969 and received her master's in public health from the University of California at Berkeley in 1975. She has received numerous awards and honorary doctorates, too numerous to mention, and she is truly an American hero and an icon of the civil rights movement that they don't teach you about in schools, and I am overjoyed and honored that she is joining us today for this conversation. So welcome, Judy. I think let me unmute you. All right, there you are.
Hello, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'll just jump right in with questions so we don't take up too much more of your time. As you describe in your book, you were the child of Holocaust refugees. So can you talk a little about how that affected their willingness to send you away to an institution as was recommended to them at the time?
So, honestly, my mother was 12, my father was 14 when they were sent out. They met in Philadelphia. It's a great story because they did all their communicating by email after they met each other in Philadelphia. They got married, moved to Brooklyn. My father and his brother opened a butcher store, and my mom was pregnant, and everything was moving forward. I think having lost their parents on both sides and other relatives really obviously had a very strong impact on their lives. And I didn't know until I was 36 years old that a doctor had recommended to my parents that I be placed in an institution. And I was sitting at our dining room table. I was home visiting, and my father mentioned this, and I was like, "Oh no, Dad, that's not possible." And he goes running up the stairs in the house, screaming out, Ilse, isn't this true? And my mother said yes. And that was kind of, honestly, all that I've ever heard about it. So, looking back, my presumption obviously is that my parents wouldn't think about giving me up, given what had happened to them. And I think, they were certainly, they were advocates in many ways, not defined as advocates, but clearly they were fighters. And my father had been in the Marines, and my brother I had polio in 1949 in August, and my brother was born 1 month later. And so they were raising a family, and I think it would not have been possible for them to give any of us up, because that was their objective: have children, raise family, improve society.
And the first line in your book is, I never wished I didn't have a disability. So other than the school issue, which we'll talk about shortly, your Brooklyn childhood sounds almost idyllic in the sense of your complete acceptance and inclusion by your friends and your family in the neighborhood. So do you think that was unusual for that era, or even for any era?
So, we lived in Brooklyn on a street that was all small homes, middle class homes, and it was new families. And my parents moved there, and I was 3 months old. And so I had lived in the neighborhood for more than a year before I had polio. And my mom and dad were close with our neighbors. So I think I was brought into the neighborhood as a non-disabled child. And again, I think, it was a change that was going on, and people wouldn't have thrown me out, because I had polio now. Had I come into the neighborhood with polio and not known other people, it could have been a very different story. But, I think this issue of, knowing our family, knowing me as a kid, having other friends in the neighborhood who were the same age, we were like a village in some very real way. Right. In other parts of the city and the country, I think, depending on where you were living and the close-knittedness of the community, I think would have an impact. But certainly, many other disabled individuals then and now don't necessarily have the same experiences as I feel like I was fortunate to have. Now, I think it's also important, though, to say that the close-knit community was on my block and our family. But, and the synagogue that we went to was also made up of family or people who knew people who knew people. It's a very small German Jewish synagogue. But once I got out of that circle, things changed. So, we were going to discuss the issue of my going to school. So my mother took me to the local neighborhood school, which was not wheelchair accessible, but my parents didn't expect anything except they would bring me to school, and the school would teach me, and they would help me if I needed help going to the bathroom and bringing me home. But at that point, there were no laws. There was no one really monitoring what was going on for kids with disabilities. And the principal said I was a fire hazard. The Board of Education sent a teacher to my house for 2.5 hours a week for the first, second, third, and half of the fourth grade. Now, one story about how I wasn't being accepted was my parents decided to try to get me into a Jewish day school. They never went to Jewish day schools, but they thought, okay, let's try this. And so the principal that my mother spoke to said I was going to go into the first grade. I didn't know enough Hebrew. And of course, my mother didn't get that I didn't know enough Hebrew was quiet language that we don't want you here. So my mother, I had a physical therapist, and his wife was a Sabra. And my mother took me to their house like religiously for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then she called the principal to say, okay, she knows enough Hebrew to go into the first grade. And the principal said, no, I couldn't go to the school. So I think, from a Jewish perspective, that really is an important story. And it's not just that it's something that happened in the Jewish community, happened in many communities, but I think it's a very important issue when, me as a Jewish disabled woman, my Judaism is very important to me. I do know, however, in many ways, the Jewish community itself is working on, but has not yet really grappled with our views towards people with disability.
I was going to ask you later, but it seems like a good time now. Have you found Jewish institutions to be accessible and welcoming to people with disabilities, and what can they do better? I assume things have changed somewhat.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I believe, the Ruderman Foundation in Massachusetts really deserves a lot of credit in raising across the country the responsibility of Jewish institutions to really be looking at the issue of the inclusion of disabled individuals in a much more proactive way. And they've had a number of projects over the years, which has resulted in more of the synagogues really, looking at things like February as National Jewish Disability Awareness Month. I go to a synagogue in Washington, D.C. called Addis Israel, and Addis, along with other synagogues, really has been addressing the issue of disability and inclusion of disabled people. I think Addis would on its own say that it has a lot further to go. The issue of, one of the important things is our synagogues and religious institutions and the way we have activities. Accessibility is clearly a very important issue. And from a physical accessibility perspective, I think much more is being done. But, for example, our synagogues are basically all now virtual. And there are virtually no synagogues that are doing virtual services with sign language interpreters or captioning. And I would say in one very real way, the Jewish deaf community is not yet really being brought in, enabled people to have opportunities. Many of our synagogues have a lot of very rich activities outside of our services. And deaf and hard of hearing people should be able to come into our synagogues, not just for religious experiences, but for Judaic experiences. And I feel in many ways that is not yet being provided. And in some very real way, as a community, we've not really addressed this issue. And likewise, for people who have intellectual disabilities, more is being done. And people who have mental health disabilities, more is being done. Certainly Jewish federations are doing a certain amount of important work. But as far as really being able to equally participate within religious life, broadly speaking, I think we still have a lot further to go. But definitely, as I said, the Rudimans really are to be congratulated for really jumpstarting this discussion in, I think, a meaningful way.
Let's talk a little bit about the summer camp that was the basis for the film Crip Camp. What was so special? Hi there. What was so special about that environment that inspired so many activists? And how do you think the movement would have developed without it?
So it's a very important question. And for those people who haven't seen Crip Camp or read my book, Being Human, I think Crip Camp is a very important film because, and what makes such a significant, why it is so significant in my mind, is the fact that there was footage that was taken by a small nonprofit organization in the Hunter, New York. And I believe the two guys that started the company happen to be Jewish also. And they brought these video cameras to the camp for a couple days to show disabled kids how you could use the videos. So what was quite unique about Jened was these video cameras that came in and took great footage. It was the campers and counselors who were involved in taking this footage. You probably could have had similar experiences at other camps if they'd also been given video cameras. What was, I guess, unique about Jened is, I think in some way, maybe randomness of who we were at the camp. I left Brooklyn to go to Berkeley, California, to work with the Center for Independent Living, which was a progressive organization that was in and of itself really doing some revolutionary work in a way. And now I don't mean like revolutionary as in the political sense, but although it was, but revolutionary in as much as it was an organization, is an organization run by disabled people, which really changed the color and flavor of the work that was being done. So it wasn't an organization run by non-disabled people for disabled people. It was run by disabled people. And what made that different was that we understood what our issues were. And we were developing an organization that was not just focused on the provision of certain kinds of services, like helping people find places to live or hiring people who are personal assistants, but we were also really getting much more deeply into the kinds of discrimination that people were experiencing and what we needed to do to make reforms. And that clearly was some of the work that came out in Jened and other disabled kids camps. This ability to come together and over a number of weeks, not only be able to become friends with people, but really begin to feel like we could discuss who we were, including our disabilities, where we were, and what we wanted to do. And being able to have discussions in the area of what we aspirationally wanted to do, in many ways was the first time that these discussions were happening. And so we were moving away from just discussing the problems that we were facing to really discussing solutions that we were trying to address. And as you know, when I went out to Berkeley, Neil Jacobson came out to Berkeley. He's in the film. Denise Scherer, who became Denise Jacobson, also came out to Berkeley. Ann Coppola, who was also in the film, came out to Berkeley. And we all, Berkeley is small, and we all got involved in different ways with CIL. So I think it was, you know, just kind of unplanned opportunities We really, I think the fact that we had the guts to leave, no matter where we went, our homes, where we were getting much of our support from our families, and kind of taking a risk to fly far away and try to be involved in creating something new. I think there was something within our individual spirits that really helped us be visionaries and recognize that we could make a difference in spite of the fact that society was not ready for that yet.
You also talk about the fact that society did not expect you to date or marry. And I know you've been married for several years, and we can change the laws, but you can't mandate people's perceptions. So do you think that perceptions have changed, or is this still a hurdle that many people need to overcome?
I absolutely think we still have a long way to go. I'm married about 28 years, and I'll tell you another little Jewish story. So I applied in San Francisco to the Jewish dating service, which was advertised in the Jewish Weekly. And the reason I applied was because they had 2 questions on disability. Do you have a disability? And would you consider dating someone with a disability? So I liked that because, with other dating services, you would have to tell somebody on the phone that you had a disability. And so I thought, great, yes, I have a disability, and I would consider dating someone with a disability. I wouldn't only date somebody with a disability. And so it's really funny. I sent it in June. It was supposed to come back in like 3 or 4 weeks. I happened to go to Israel that summer. It was the first time I'd gone to Israel. And I came back, I think, like in August. And it was like September. And I had friends over. We were going to someone's funeral who had died from AIDS. And I asked my friends to get my mail. And so they did. And there was a letter. And I'm like, oh, okay, because I'd been wondering why I hadn't gotten a response. So I opened it up, and a check fell on the floor. And there was a letter that said, there was no one in their pool who met the criteria that I had checked off the boxes for, which of course was completely ridiculous, because if I hadn't said that I had a disability, I could have just said I was willing to date someone with a disability. I probably would have gotten names. And if I ignored both of them, I certainly would have gotten names. But I think we've gotten further now than we were in the mid-1980s. Actually, I was just talking to someone doing an interview who's 23, and my colleague who's 24 was here. And I was asking her, so what do you think? Would you date someone with a disability without a second thought? And she said, no, honestly, I would definitely think about it before I would. And my colleague Stevie said, and families probably would still be objecting. And only a month or 2 ago, there was something in the New York Times where a woman had written to have some kind of a column saying that she was dating someone who had some health conditions, which were disabilities. And she didn't know whether she should move forward because she was concerned. And the answer to the question from this reporter was, no, break it off now. So I think this is not a Jewish thing only. I think definitely people are learning more because of laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, on and on. But on a day-to-day level, I think people are afraid of disability. I think people are afraid of acquiring a disability themselves. And unless you have a family member where you have to be more engaged in trying to be of assistance, or you're helping a friend or something, I think it's something that people still, they don't look at us like they look at many other people. It's a different look.
Going back to your personal history for a moment, can you tell us a little about your struggle to be hired as a teacher in New York City and all the legal battles that ensued around that?
So I had wanted to be a teacher, and my friends in high school had told me not to tell the agency that was going to be supporting me to go to college that I wanted to be a teacher, because in New York City at that time, we knew of no one who had applied to become a teacher and was a wheelchair user. And so I majored in speech and theater. I minored in education. I contacted the American Civil Liberties Union and told them what my concerns were when I was a freshman or a sophomore. And they told me, contact them if in fact I was denied a job. So I graduated school. I had the credits I needed to apply to be a teacher. I took an oral exam, a written exam, both offered in completely inaccessible buildings because there were no laws requiring that accessibility be provided. And I took my medical exam, also in an inaccessible building. I passed my written, I passed my oral, and was failed on my medical. So that was a really important turning point in my life. I think in many ways really launched me more in becoming a more public advocate, because I had to make a decision as to whether or not I was going to try to sue the Board of Ed. Again, no laws in place. I called the ACLU, told them what happened, asked if I could come and meet them. And they called me back and said, no, it wasn't an issue of discrimination. They had denied me my job for medical reasons, that I couldn't walk. And no, they didn't want to talk. So I would say the ACLU today has definitely come a long way. They do some very good work in disability. And I know when I tell this story, ACLU supporters, kind of cringe at what things were like. But I think it's an important piece of history because it still goes on. But I was very lucky to find two attorneys, one guy named Roy Lucas, who went on to become a famous lawyer in the abortion Roe versus Wade case, and argued before the Supreme Court. And he and an attorney who went to my father's butcher store offered his services for free. We had the first African-American female judge to be appointed to the federal court. And she basically told the Board of Ed that she encouraged them to do another medical exam. And they did, and I got my license, and I taught for 3 years.
Of course, I remember from the book that just winning the case didn't mean that you had a job. You still had a struggle after that point, right?
Exactly. I couldn't find a job, both because many of the schools were not accessible and the same issue, that I wasn't being given a chance. So I ultimately was hired by the principal of the school that I had gone to when I was 9 years old. And I taught at a license for the first year. I taught in special ed classes. And then the next 2 years I taught second grade. And then left Brooklyn and went to Berkeley, and unfortunately didn't go back to classroom teaching again.
And one of your first major political actions, the occupation of the federal building in San Francisco to protest the lack of enforcement of Section 504, which, for people who don't know, prohibited discrimination in federally funded institutions. The public was stunned because, as you say, they were used to disabled people being invisible. So how far do you think we've come in that struggle for people to understand their own self-worth and not allow themselves to be ignored?
It's a great question. And I would say that definitely as a result of 504, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, movements like the Deaf President Now movement in 1984-85, the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have seen a growing voice of disabled people coming forward. More organizations being created, run by disabled individuals, or organizations like Disability In and the National Organization on Disability that are focusing on employment and working with employers, and other laws that are really forcing employers, for example, who get money from the federal government or are obligated as a contractor to hire disabled individuals who are qualified for the jobs. People are slowly, the 61 million disabled people in the United States, more of us are coming forward. but I think it's a very important question because many people have invisible disabilities, depression, anxiety, bipolar, diabetes, epilepsy, Tourette's, Parkinson's, whatever it may be. And people with invisible disabilities are frequently afraid of discussing their disabilities. They're afraid of what could happen in a job interview, what might happen when they get a job, if they get a job. So I think for me, one of the big issues is disability occurs across the lifespan. Many people on this webinar today who are getting older are finding that they're having issues, physical disability issues, vision issues, hearing issues, memory issues, various things. And you have disabilities. And you may not want to be going out filing a complaint because you may not have experienced disability, but being able to talk to other people who are involved in looking both at implementation of laws, looking at new laws that we may need, like in the area of home and community-based services, being able to have better supports to live in our homes without having to be fearful of moving into an institution, being able to get money to help modify our homes and apartments. Those are all things that we need to have happen. But I think equally important, you know, what did we get out of this crip camp? What we got as disabled individuals was the ability to be ourselves, the ability to talk about what was happening in our lives, not to say that we only wanted to be with disabled people, quite the contrary. We wanted to be able to have choice to be in a community with the people that we wanted to be with, whether they had disabilities or not. But we didn't have that choice because of lots of inaccessibility, including people's biases. So my hope over the future is that we continue to grow as a cross-disability movement, that people recognize the value of identifying as having a disability and speak up about it, like in our synagogues. You know, as people are getting older, things like captioning are not just relevant for disabled individuals. Having loops, audio loops, so that people can hear better. Using microphones so that people are able to hear. There are kosher for Shabbos microphones. And so if you're in a synagogue where, you know, you don't use microphones, there are microphones that you can get that are okay for Shabbos. So look at, you know, more of our synagogues are really looking at the issue of LGBTQ and racial diversity and are addressing those issues in a more forthright way. We need to be consciously doing the same thing in disability, and we're not quite there yet.
Now, you do make the point also in your book how redesigning our landscape for accessibility benefits everyone, not just people with disabilities. Like, I can't imagine getting around a city with a baby stroller without curb cuts and elevators and ramps. You know, it's not a zero-sum game. It improves the world for everyone. So why do you think there has been a reluctance historically to adapt our society and our environment in this way?
I think because as a community of people, not just disabled people, that we haven't come forward really insisting. So in New York City, for example, there have been a number of new stations that have been constructed that are not meeting code, and they're being sued. Now, it would have been great if people, you know, non-disabled individuals, you know, would be now demanding that anything newly being constructed and any renovations, in fact, comply with the law. Because, as I said, it may not impact you individually today, but it may well impact you tomorrow if you break a foot. Your daughter has a kid, you have a kid, you want to be able to move around the community So I think it's look beyond who we are today and look at this issue as one of universal design. Reach out to disability-run organizations, talk to people, see how you can get involved, both in possibly volunteering, getting on boards, making financial contributions, learning about the laws like the ADA and city and state laws in New York and other parts of the country. You know, be proactive, learn about the kinds of discrimination people are facing. And, you know, as a people, we're very social justice oriented. And we need to recognize that disability cuts across every area that we're interested in and working for justice.
And you talk about in your book how the telephone was a lifeline for you, and you write about when you were home recovering from surgery in college, you actually accessed your classes by phone, which made you feel more connected rather than less, because it removed the barriers to the physical barriers that you had to deal with every day, like being carried up and down a flight of stairs. So that made me think about our present moment, living through the COVID-19 pandemic, this lockdown situation. Do you feel that the playing field has been leveled a little bit, or that the rest of the world is now experiencing a little bit more of your world?
Yeah, I think definitely. You know, I think, for example, about even in COVID, people who are, you know, taking appropriate protective measures, who can kind of get in their car and go out and go into the country and do different things. You know, that's something that my husband and I can't do, and because we don't drive right now. And so on the one hand, everybody is home, basically, working from their home. So that does make things a little bit more equal. I think we're all experiencing the same types of concerns, whether you have a disability or not. And I am hoping that as we move through COVID, where we know there's going to be dramatic changes on the other end, in part because we've done so much stuff virtually, looking at how much we want to continue to do virtually, how much we want to go back to the way things were before, and how to do that. I want to make sure that also people don't think that because we've been doing things virtually, that disabled people want to do everything virtually. I think what we have learned from this is that whether you have a disability or not, you could be a parent with a child or have a mother or father or someone that you're taking care of, where working at home virtually, part-time or full-time, might make more sense for you. But don't just look at it as a disability thing. Look at it as something which is something that as a society, we need to be looking at how we're going to make reforms. And we need to look at the fact that we, in so many ways, did not support virtual employment, and how we've really learned that there are ways of doing meaningful work virtually.
Can you tell us a little about the process of writing your book and how it came about, how you collaborated with your co-author?
So that is a great question. People have been talking to me about writing a book for many, many years. And I am not a confident writer. And also, I'm very busy, and I never would have taken the time to try to learn how to write well enough to write a book. So a friend of mine knew a company called Gravity Squared, and he spoke to them about me, and they reached out. And in discussions, they helped me identify an agent who helped me identify a writer, Kristen Joyner. And that was a real journey in and of itself, because Kristen lived in San Francisco. She had a job in Washington, D.C., flying back and forth. Then she left her job in D.C., went back to San Francisco, and then eventually with her husband, who was from New Zealand, moved to New Zealand. So there were a number of major moving parts, to say nothing of time zone, because they're a day ahead of us. But, you know, she really I've liked working with Kristen. She's not a disabled woman, but she has done a lot of work in the area of women's rights and rights of other groups. And it, I think, was a good experience for us and for me to really work with someone who's a very good writer, but also who didn't know that much about disability, in really being able to come up with a book which truly reflects me. And we spent an immense amount of time going over the book and talking about different parts of my life and her writing and my reading and rewriting. And so it was really, I learned a lot from it. Yeah.
Well,
So,
your voice really comes through on the book.
yeah, thank you.
So I don't want to take too much more time because I want to move to Q&A, but can we talk just for a moment about the Black Lives Matter movement? I know you've worked for an inclusive movement all your life, but in this historical moment, how is the disability rights movement addressing racism?
I think there's some very important things that are happening. We've seen over the last number of years a growing community of, well, really for decades, a growing community of disabled individuals from different racial backgrounds. Black community, the Latino community, the Asian community, the Native American community, on and on. And I think there have been some tensions and healthy tensions that have been emerging for people who feel like they have not been included and that racism has existed within our community. And I think it's something that is being addressed and continues to need to be addressed. In the Black Lives Matter movement, I think one very important part that's emerged is the Black Disabled Lives Matter, which I think is also very important. That, you know, in many communities like the Jewish community and others, the recognition of disabled people within our communities is not something that's been front and center. And so I think within each of our communities, being able to raise our own voices to help ensure that we're more recognized and included in the communities that we identify with is very important. And the disability community itself is truly, I think, becoming a more inclusive community. One of the very positive things about Crip Camp is that something called the Impact Campaign has emerged out of that. And the Impact Campaign has really been doing some very important work. They're running a program every Sunday that started, I think, in May through the middle of August, called Crip Camp 2020. Every Sunday, there's like an hour and a half to 2 hours of people doing presentations and having discussion. And it's a very, very diverse group of people, racially and disability-wise. People are seeing themselves more appropriately reflected, all of which I think is really very important. We certainly have a lot further to go, but I think one of the important parts about what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Disabled Lives Matter is it's been a very powerful learning experience for me. I've known and have definitely been speaking out against what is happening to Black and Brown disabled individuals. When you look at the juvenile injustice system, as a friend of mine coined, and you see 60 to 70% of people in the juvenile facilities having disabilities, many of those individuals should have been receiving special education services from when they were young, not in segregated settings, in integrated settings, and have not been served. And so you begin to see, you know, poor Black, poor Brown, disabled individuals with invisible disabilities very frequently falling out of the system, being pushed out of the system. And for those of us who are working on issues around school to prison pipeline, we have got to recognize the disproportionate number of disabled youth who are in that system, and subsequently the disproportionate number of disabled adults in the adult system. And we've got to be able to speak about, disabled individuals who are Black and brown and are being killed by the police, and we're not discussing the fact that they've had disabilities. So there's a great woman named Kerry Gray, Kerigray. She's got a website, and on her website, she lists a number of disabled individuals who are Black and have been killed by the police with various forms of disabilities. So for those of us in the Jewish community who are doing work on this issue and have been before what happened this year, we have got to understand how disability is a part of this issue, and that we need to be speaking out against it. And we need to be working with the disability community and others on fighting against this.
Thank you. Sorry, my cats are fighting behind me.
Okay.
Finally, this month marks the 30th anniversary of the ADA, which is an important anniversary. So where do we go from here? What is happening under the current administration, and how can we support disability rights in this political climate?
As I've been saying, I think you support disability rights by if you have a disability, visible or invisible, you begin to look at how you view yourself. Do you feel ashamed of your disability? Do you hide it? Do you speak about it? Are you looking for organizations in your communities that are fighting for disability rights? If you're a member of the synagogue, are you speaking up about things that the synagogues need to do in order to allow us to participate more equally? And how do you view your future? And in viewing your future, do you see engaging in a more public way, being supportive of what disability rights groups are trying to do? I think those are all very important things. As I said earlier, 61 million disabled people. If 5 or 10 million of us were much more public, that would be amazing. And I think very much that we have to be looking at COVID, and we have to be looking at the elections. I talk about looking at COVID because, well, obviously for many reasons, but one of them is the death rate of people who have died in nursing homes and other congregate living settings are disproportionately people who have disabilities. They may be older, but they've got disabilities. They're in these senior programs and others because they have disabilities. If they didn't have disabilities, they wouldn't be in these settings. And so what we need to look at is, what do we need to ensure that people don't wind up in these institutions where not only are people at greater risk of dying when things like COVID happens, but if you go in and look at the data also, you'll see that sexual assault against people in these institutions is also much more prevalent and underreported. So as a community, we really need to be fighting for programs that enable people, as I said earlier, to stay in the community, to live in the community, to get the supports they need in their homes, to be able to get money to modify their homes. And I also think it's really important that we look at the ordinances in our cities and counties and states. There really is not a reason that we have to be building houses that are so completely inaccessible. You know, the Berkeley Hills had a major fire in like 1989. Beautiful homes that had, many of them, stairs to heaven. And when hundreds of homes burnt down and people rebuilt their homes, now these people were 10, 15 years into their homes at least, and you would have thought that they would have built their homes so that they were more accessible, but they didn't. And why? You know, not thinking about your future, your family's future. I think really we have to delve more deeply into what do we need with, as disabled and non-disabled people, to live in our communities and not have to be relegated to institutions where our lives are at risk.
Okay, let's move on to a couple of questions from the audience. The first is, thank you for sharing your story. How is it that Ed Roberts' name is better known in the disability community?
Roberts. He was a very dear friend of mine, and he is the reason I went to Berkeley. But absolutely, Ed was a guy. And I also want to say, I don't want to dump things on Ed, because it certainly wasn't just Ed. It was the time we were living in, and the time we were living in was very much where women's voices were emerging more. I mean, the women's movement was really being born more. And as disabled women, I think it was important for us to be able to learn from each other and support each other in being able to become stronger disabled women. So Ed was a dynamic man. I don't want to take anything away from his contributions, but I think it's definitely true that disabled women have not been seen and heard from and given the respect that I think we deserve for the contributions we've made.
We have a few questions from viewers about Jewish institutions. The first one is, how can they do a better job of supporting disabled people on their staff?
I think it would be good for these organizations, to really have an open environment with the employees that may be disabled. Probably, looking for opportunities for disabled staff across Jewish institutions in similar communities to be able to come together and talk about what some of the barriers are they're experiencing. In some cases, people may feel that they're not being heard, or they're afraid of speaking up about things. So looking at ways of maybe an affinity group that cuts across, as I was saying. I think the other is becoming, while Jewish institutions, like other religious institutions, are not required to comply with certain federal laws, nonetheless, I think it's a good practice. And so I think it's important that they really understand what laws like 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act and other laws require, and get training about what they need to do. And again, potentially bringing in a facilitator who can help with a discussion of disabled employees, to really listen to what people are saying. I mean, you're seeing this in companies like Google and Microsoft and bigger companies, where disabled employees are coming together to speak to management, to talk about what some of the concerns are that they have.
Someone else is asking what Jewish museums, archives, and libraries can do to become more accessible to disabled patrons.
Again, I think a lot of this is so based on individuals. Libraries, I think, in many ways have been better than many other institutions. So since the libraries, we've got private libraries and public libraries, but again, looking at having discussions about what the problems are and looking at ways of developing resolutions. And again, I would look at, what are some of the things going on in the public libraries on issues like accessibility, including universities, looking at some that are doing good work and being able to identify those practices so that they could be integrated in helping reform other institutions that maybe are not doing their job as they should be.
We only have time for one more question, so let's go with this one. As someone in my mid-20s, I have struggled a lot with the Jewish community and dating. I appreciate your work and have two questions. One, as you mentioned, the ADA has not really changed social perception of disability. Do you think there are other ways that laws can truly promote social acceptance of disability? And two, do you have any thoughts on the recent SCOTUS decision related to civil rights protections in employment in religious institutions?
You can't legislate people's attitudes. You can't make someone like you or dislike you based on a law. I think what really is important is that we as disabled people and as allies of disabled people really become much more aware of, what is making you make this comment? Why are you feeling the way you are? Allowing people to know that you're not feeling like you're being accepted into the community like you wish. And I frequently think it's difficult to do this by yourself. I have found, having other people who can speak about changes that we want to see happen is very important, in that frequently speaking as an individual, not just about disability, but in this case, disability, people frequently, they don't want to listen, they don't know what to do. There isn't the support that needs to happen in many ways from other people within the congregation, in part because they don't understand it either. I think we just need to have much more serious discussions about what we are experiencing and how it's making us feel not included as we would like to be included. On the decision around the Supreme Court case, I'm not a lawyer, and are you speaking about the case around LGBTQ? If that's the case, I'm fully supportive of what the court did. I think it's very important that when looking at the issues of employment, that religious institutions should not be able to discriminate against disabled individuals, although I believe there was some language in there which maybe had some carving outs about what they could potentially do. Ethically and morally, I think religious institutions need to comply with our laws, particularly anti-discrimination laws based on race, disability, and gender, because why shouldn't we?
Thank you so much, Judy. I would like to remind everyone to please watch Crip Camp on Netflix and to read Judy's book, Being Human. That's Heumann. It's been an amazing honor. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with me for the Center for Jewish History.
Thank you very much. It was great to be with you all.
Bye. Take care, everyone.